But the Trump administration's most significant decisions will be about U.S. policy toward China. The big question is whether the 21st century will be marked by conflict or cooperation between the two most powerful and prosperous countries on the planet. 25 years ago, China made up less than 2% of global GDP. Today, that figure is 15%, second only to America's 24%. In the next decade or so, the Chinese economy will surpass the size of America's, according to the Center for Economics and Business Research. Already, 9 of the 20 most valuable tech companies in the world are based in China.
As China and the United States have hit a new low. Mutual rivalry in the Pacific is becoming more menacing, with intense saber rattling on both sides. US naval vessels have been staging maneuvers in what they see as a response to Chinese expansionism. Also, new American sanctions against the crackdown in Hong Kong and tit-for-tat consular closures. So our question here on To The Point this week is USA versus China. A new Cold War?
Well, first of all, these are statements we've come to expect. As you identified, this is state-owned media. They make very explosive, confrontational, bombastic statements, like threatening nuclear war is the statement that's been made here.
Bitcoin. Speaking at a Nixon Foundation event, Thiel said, quote, "I do wonder whether if at this point Bitcoin should also be thought of in part as a Chinese financial weapon against the U.S. It threatens fiat money, but it especially threatens the dollar." He says he's not against cryptos, but that the government should take a closer look at why China is long Bitcoin. Bitcoin higher again today, up nearly 700% in the past year. Michael, explain this to me. How would China use Bitcoin as a weapon to weaken the dollar?
Well, I think, you know, the general premise here is that Bitcoin's ascendance does come at the expense of the dollar's role as the world reserve currencies.
Understand what's going on around you. You are in a state of war, and you have precious little time to save yourself. With every second, the disaster is coming closer and closer.
There is a new Cold War on the horizon, but instead of oil, the space race, or nuclear weapons, this one is being fought through the penetration of currencies, specifically the US dollar against the renminbi, also frequently referred to as the Chinese yuan.
Sophia, are authorities getting more comfortable with the stronger yuan?
That is a very good question. So exactly after the currency rally to the strongest level in 5 years against the basket, everyone was kind of on the alert for any signals from the PBOC or whether gains would continue to reduce inflationary pressures, which is exactly what analysts have been calling. It can be a weapon, it can be a tool for that. So that statement was kind of neutral, but it is talking down expectations in financial markets right now. That the yuan is the one-way bet, and that's the only way it's going right now is up.
Tensions are on the rise between the two superpowers as China's GDP has soared within the past few years, pacing to overtake the United States GDP within the next coming years.
So China's economy grew a record 18.3% in the first quarter of 2021. That compared to the same quarter last year. And that is according to the country's National Bureau of Statistics. It's the biggest jump in GDP since China started keeping quarterly records in 1992.
But from the past few years, China is growing inevitably. And there's an ongoing discussion that China might surpass the US in the global power structure. But is it really possible? Can China actually surpass the US?
The single most transformational economic event over the last century was World War II, as governments overprinted and overspent money on defense. Many European nations were faced with financial bankruptcy and saw their currencies significantly devalued. And when the war was finally over, their balance sheets were far too weak to rebuild infrastructure or participate in international trade. In 1944, in an effort to stabilize the global economy, many of the world's leaders came together to introduce the gold standard. It was decided that most of the world's currencies would become tied to the US dollar at a fixed exchange rate, which in turn would be backed by gold held in vaults. A new entity, the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, was created to police these exchange rates, while all the participating countries would ship their gold to the US.
At Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, delegates from 44 allied and associate countries arrived for the opening of the United Nations Monetary and Financial Conference. Invited by President Roosevelt to the first major world financial meeting since the London Conference of 1933, they will work in the seclusion of this White Mountains resort. Zhang Shi-kung, one of China's representatives, with Secretary and Mrs. Henry Morgenthau. United States Treasury Secretary Morgenthau heads the American delegation. On the opening day, in his role of acting conference president, he addresses the meeting. To be discussed are plans for the stabilization of world currencies. All agreements must be ratified by the governing bodies of the nations involved before becoming effective. The financial conference pose on the hotel lawn. These meetings are designed to promote trade in the post-war world and to create a foundation for lasting peace.
After the gold standard was introduced, the post-war period between 1945 and 1970 was perhaps the greatest period of economic stability and prosperity of the last century. Countries were investing heavily in infrastructure and manufacturing, which provided well-paying jobs, giving rise to the middle class and the birth of the so-called American dream. It was during this time that the U.S. assumed its world dominance in the political sphere, largely due to the lingering weakness of recovering European economies and their lack of infrastructure and manufacturing capacity. In 1971, Nixon abolished the gold standard to continue funding war efforts in Vietnam, and the world has not been the same since.
The third indispensable element in building the new prosperity is closely related to creating new jobs and halting inflation. We must protect the position of the American dollar as a pillar of monetary stability around the world. In the past 7 years, there's been an average of one international monetary crisis every year. Now, who gains from these crises? Not the working man, not the investor, not the real producers of wealth. The gainers are the international money speculators. Because they thrive on crises, they help to create them. In recent weeks, the speculators have been waging an all-out war on the American dollar. The strength of a nation's currency is based on the strength of that nation's economy. And the American economy is by far the strongest in the world. Accordingly, I have directed the Secretary of the Treasury to take the action necessary to defend the dollar against the speculators. I have directed Secretary Connally to suspend temporarily the convertibility of the dollar into gold or other reserve assets, except in amounts and conditions determined to be in the interest of monetary stability and in the best interest of the United States.
Now that you see the current financial market is essentially a Ponzi scheme that will eventually implode, many countries, especially China, are leveraging from these financial flaws in our current economic system, and the dominance of the US dollar is not as strong as it once was. The US dollar remains widely regarded as the global reserve currency, but beginning in 1995, many European countries started using the euro instead, which was meant to unify the European region through trade. China started working on its own currency accession plan to stimulate its trade and economic growth between 1994 and 2005, when it pegged the yuan to the US dollar. Widely regarded as an economic miracle, China embraced widespread centralized economic reforms, averaging a GDP growth of 10% annually and lifting half of its 1.3 billion people out of poverty. China is projected to surpass the United States as the world's largest economy in the next decade. In 2016, the Chinese yuan was the first emerging market currency to be allowed into the IMF SDR basket, and by 2019 became the 8th most traded currency in the world. The growing might of China has put Western powers on high alert, but the next Cold War will not be fought by exerting dominance in the physical world, but rather in the digital one. Data has become more valuable than oil. Modern societies are now powered using oceans of data, with Facebook and Google at the forefront. In the physical world, the US is known for weaponizing its currency using a sanction to alter global behavior, but in the digital world, it simultaneously wages war on its own tech companies, with regulations effectively and unwittingly disabling the very tools that could help it achieve lasting global dominance. While our governments increasingly make attempts to regulate data, they haven't quite figured out how to regulate money that isn't tied to borders. The global economy has become more integrated, with China's economy growing strongly. More importantly, China has become the top trading partner and creditor investor for many countries. The size and penetration of the Chinese economy have rendered a strategy of containing China impractical and costly to all sides, and makes the US-China contention more protracted and difficult. The West thus faces a dilemma. Efforts to decouple from China in order to limit its influence would hurt not only China, but also Western countries and the global economy more broadly. But striking a trade deal with China to reduce tensions will likely help the Chinese economy perform better, making the strategic competition with Beijing more intractable. The rivalry has slowly led to a bifurcation of the global economy, most discernible in high-tech areas such as the tension between digital authoritarianism, digital liberalism, artificial intelligence, and surveillance technologies, satellite-based navigation for civilian and military uses, and 5G SG telecommunications, and most of all, China's dominance in the use and the mining of Bitcoin. So why is China using Bitcoin, and why would they use Bitcoin to take down the US economy? First, we need to look into why Bitcoin and the blockchain technology a major disruptor to the current financial system. So why Bitcoin?
Bitcoin. First, they ignore you.
What do you fear?
Then they laugh at you.
Yes, everyone's drinking the Kool-Aid, I think.
Then they fight you.
I have to say this, and I'll say it just once.
Then you win.
Governments cannot stop this innovation, and those that have tried have already failed.
All you creeps that are controlling money all throughout the world, your time is slowly closing in.
Ever since its inception, Bitcoin has been called many things.
Bitcoin, for those of you who don't know, is an electronic online currency that was created in 2009.
Bitcoin is better than currency in that you don't have to be physically in the same place. And of course, for large transactions, currency can get pretty inconvenient.
Bitcoin is fundamentally different because in Bitcoin, you don't owe anyone anything and no one owes you anything. It is not a system based on that. It is a system based on ownership, and no one can censor it, no one can seize it, no one can freeze it.
In the press, it has been pronounced dead more than 300 times, and yet today it stands stronger than ever. When Bitcoin first launched in 2009 as a response to the financial crisis, it was considered a pipe dream for it to reach $1 per Bitcoin. Surprisingly, it only took 2 years for Bitcoin to reach parity with the US dollar. This happened 7 years ago on February 9th, 2011. Devoted Bitcoin hodlers have been greatly rewarded in the following years as prices saw 3, 4, and even 5-figure sums. These early investors understood the value of Bitcoin's design and the fact that there could only ever be 21 million Bitcoin.
Where does supply of Bitcoin come from? And are you sure the market doesn't get oversupplied?
The supply of Bitcoin is determined algorithmically based on a geometrically declining supply function, meaning that in the beginning, every 10 minutes, 50 new Bitcoin are created. So every block, the heartbeat, 10 minutes, created 50 new Bitcoin. This Bitcoin is used as a reward in a game theory-based security model that ensures that every transaction is independently validated by completely anonymous actors who have to stake electricity as a guarantee of the security work they've done. And if they succeed in doing the security work of validating transactions correctly, they earn as a reward, based on a probabilistic return, that reward. 50 Bitcoin every 10 minutes. That's how currency is introduced into the economy. Every 4 years, it gets cut in half. As a system, it's designed to have a monetary policy that is purposefully deflationary and simulates the issuance of precious metals. It gets harder and harder and harder to mine gold at greater and greater and greater cost. And Bitcoin is the same. The idea being that less and less is issued over time. If you follow that geometric curve, at some point you reach the end. In the year 2141, Bitcoin is no longer issued. 21 million coins is the asymptotic cap. That is part of the protocol. It is an unchangeable part of the protocol, and it is a rule enforced by every system that participates in the Bitcoin network.
Governments can forbid the usage of Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies, as Russia and China recently did. But since the transactions are designed to disintermediate central authority, the ban has only made its citizens more drawn to it. China's answer was not just to ban Bitcoin, but to give its people an alternative, the DCEP, Digital Currency Electronic Payment System. China becoming the first country to create a central bank-backed digital currency shouldn't come as a surprise. After all, this is a country that has wider penetration of digital payments than any other region in the world. Chinese Bitcoin mining pools and Bitcoin miners are acting as a sort of dissent within the Chinese political system. While some local governments may support them, the central government in China has strongly embraced blockchain and its own central bank digital currency, the DCEP, while shunning cryptocurrencies. Or at least that is what the media is telling you. China will make these announcements about how they are banning Bitcoin, but the truth of the matter is China has no intentions to actually banning Bitcoin at all. During these events, you could see popularity of Bitcoin increase with large increases in value and price of Bitcoin, followed by a so-called China ban that historically each time the value of Bitcoin has dropped over 30% after China makes their bogus announcements that they are banning Bitcoin. However, China controls over 60% of the Bitcoin mining worldwide. Mining operations in China, sometimes tens of thousands of computers wired together solving complex computerized math problems. The Bitcoin industry alone is on track to rank amongst China's 10 biggest power users, alongside sectors like steel making and cement production. That would make China's Bitcoin producers bigger consumers of energy than the entire nation of Italy.
以未来的比特币、电子货币，包括整个的加密货币里面，我觉得这是一个发展的方向，它会方便我们的生活。 长城的机房，就是矿场。大连是整个矿工行业里面算是一个比较特殊的，因为它的环境、空气质量，还有一个条件相对是比较好的。其他城市的目前的矿场条件都比较艰苦，而且矿工的生活也是很枯燥的。好，现在看到的就是我们那个长城镇的机房，这是我们大连的1号机房。现在有3层楼，我们使用的是第2层。我是目前这个矿场的总经理，我主要负责这整个场地的安全的运转工作，包括员工、包括设备、包括供电。很简单的说，是在整个互联网上，我们大家在抢答一道题，这样的话，我们谁计算正确的话，就会得到奖励。这个奖励就是我们现在的虚拟货币，也就是目前矿场的比特币。以前最多的时候，我们大概每天能挖接近100个比特币，但是随着难度的增加跟算力的增加，我们的这个比例在逐渐的在改变，这样可能还关系到，我觉得比特币确实是钱的未来，是一种，它不可能是替代现有的金融体系，但它是一种未来金融体系发展的一个方向。比特币的价钱不稳定，是因为目前还是在比特币发展的初期阶段，说白了还是在我们的挖矿期，就类似于我们从中国传统的那种到我们现在的使用的银行卡操作、信用卡操作，我们愿意相信它的原因就是它是一种时代的趋势，是一个金融社会发展的一个必经的一个过程。我觉得中国政府目前的状态是不支持也不反对，只要是比特币在一个安全又合法的状态下运营的话，我觉得中国政府应该是在未来的应该是支持。
These announcements that China makes are just propaganda to manipulate the price of Bitcoin so they could hedge more Bitcoin by liquidating Bitcoin holders by them buying Bitcoin from holders who bought at a higher price, who then would sell them for a much lower price due to FUD, which is also known as fear, uncertainty, and doubt. They have been doing this ongoing in a vicious cycle for several years. So what do you think? Could it all just be a coincidence? There is no question that there is a rival between the United States and China when it comes to mining Bitcoin.
This is a Bitcoin mine hidden deep in the mountains of Sichuan in China. And its rival is on the other side of the planet, at a former factory that used to make denim for Levi's.
You see the transformers lined up on the outside. We have a lot of megawatts.
These two miners make money by providing the massive computing power that's required to process and record a high volume of cryptocurrency transactions. Business was soaring as Bitcoin hit new highs in early 2021.
It's hard to sleep. You go to bed at night and you wake up and you look and you go, holy crap, it's still up.
Last year, China controlled 70% of the global processing power that runs the Bitcoin network. And that means the majority of the cryptocurrency's global transactions are routed through these computers in China and recorded by miners here. So a group of US miners is raising hundreds of millions of dollars to win a larger share of Bitcoin's processing power.
When capitalism in the States decides it wants to get into a market and get into an industry, it moves heavy capital there.
They say their work is also meant to protect Bitcoin. Industry insiders say the Chinese government has already cracked down on some crypto entrepreneurs and could potentially disrupt global trading by asking miners in China to block certain users from making transactions.
It's better for cryptocurrency to be spread around the globe so that Bitcoin cannot be manipulated by any single government.
I think there will be competition. More and more human resources, technology resources are putting into this particular new segment.
The battle over Bitcoin mining will decide who controls the infrastructure that powers the cryptocurrency.
As Bitcoin popularity continues to grow, you are starting to see there being more and more people getting involved in mining Bitcoin, especially in the United States. Even though the popularity has continued to grow, China still controls a large portion of mining and the Bitcoin markets.
Michael, explain this to me. How would China use Bitcoin as a weapon to weaken the dollar?
Well, I think, the general premise here is that Bitcoin's ascendance does come at the expense of the dollar's role as the world reserve currency. So if, in fact, China had some kind of participation in that trend where the U.S. dollar is not as central to the world financial system and economy as it was before, and meantime, if, in fact, official Chinese authorities are owning Bitcoin and benefiting from its appreciation, it could, tilt the financial balance of power, I suppose. It is interesting here because, of course, Thiel is very much an advocate for cryptocurrencies and Bitcoin as well. He's more or less pointing out that this becomes a little bit disorderly in terms of a power relationship thing if the ultimate destiny of Bitcoin that the true believers see out there for it as sort of overtaking to some degree existing currencies, would have other unintended consequences.
I think the idea of it as a store of value is building, even though it is volatile. You've seen this massive run up, but Tyler, I do spend time in technology, but I also spent a lot of time living in China, and I know that it's very hard to argue that China is long Bitcoin. In fact, China sees the cryptocurrency as a bigger threat to the Communist Party, I think, more than it's worrying about it as a threat to the US dollar. What they are interested in is the technology behind Bitcoin, blockchain. You had earlier this week China coming out saying it's going to be launching its own digital yuan. That may be where the real threat is. China is moving quickly on this technology. US, it has talked about a digital dollar, but there's been no action, and maybe for good reason. There needs to be very thoughtful and planned out. But I think that is where the real threat is. And if the Chinese get their massive population to use a digital yuan, that could lead to more usage of Bitcoin, and to this point, that could eventually sort of take over the US dollar.
Now you're starting to see other celebrities and influential people, including BitBoy Crypto, one of the largest cryptocurrency channels out there. He too believes that China is up to no good and that they are using Bitcoin to their advantage to take on the global economy, and even going as far as being responsible for COVID-19.
Since the USSR fell, there's been no challenger to the United States militarily or economically, until now. Over the last year, people have noted the rise of China as a superpower. It's all but official at this point. But you see, in 2020, military conflict is not the same that it used to be. In the Middle Ages, you could attack your enemy by catapulting a stone at their castle and causing physical damage. In the 2020s, we use missiles and drones. But physical damage can easily be replaced. We have the resources to do it, and China probably doesn't have the resources to strike us right now. But if they were to attack us, we'd have so many nukes pointed at them that they would surely never go that route. But in an increasingly technological world that makes borders disappear, China doesn't have to throw rocks at us. They can hurt us in much deeper ways. And when it comes to the disease that started the pandemic, this thing was orchestrated from the very beginning. And it isn't even really a conspiracy, in my opinion. Many people believe the virus started in a lab in Wuhan. No, people don't think China created the virus in a lab. The speculation is that an animal with the virus bit a human in the lab, and that's how the whole thing began. Whether you believe that or not, there is agreement that it started in Wuhan, obviously one way or the other. So what did China do? And this is where you realize the source of the virus isn't even relevant to understanding what China has done. China locked down Wuhan internally, forcing their people to stay at home under military force. Other nearby provinces were completely locked down, and China was able to control the virus by keeping the people from Wuhan away from the rest of China. Can't really believe any of their numbers, of course, but it's apparent that they were able to contain it at a certain point. But the fact is, China pushed foreign travel for those in Wuhan. You want to go to your neighbor's house? Nah, not going to happen. But you want to hop on a plane and fly to an international destination like San Francisco? Hey, sure thing, we got you. You cannot look me in the face and seriously say that was not an orchestrated plan by China. What else would it be? China is the second biggest economy in the world and had a ways to go to catch us. But now they may actually catch our GDP, some say by the end of this year. Because of a worldwide pandemic who hit America harder than any other country that began in China. It's like a movie script, but real life. America's very way of life was actually used against us. We love liberty and freedom and individualism. All of these things made us more susceptible to the pandemic. You don't think Chinese researchers and scientists were smart enough to know that? This chart shows the share of the global economy in early 2020. We also know the Q2 report for the U.S. economy showed its GDP growth shrank a staggering 35%. So you can look at the numbers in this chart, do the math, and China is nipping at our heels with no signs of stopping. Please think about this. Economists are now saying that the pandemic has accelerated China's growth. The epicenter for the breakout that crushed other countries' economies has came out on the better side of this crisis. If that doesn't smell fishy, then I don't know what does. Almost like they were prepared for the crisis again. Use your brains, people. Meanwhile, in the United States, we're struggling like crazy. We just continue to get more bad news. But of course, the stock market keeps going up. Weird. But recently, Yelp reported that 60% of businesses that have closed in the United States will become permanent closures. Our way of life is changing. I don't think people have fully grasped that yet. One day, in about 5 years, you're going to come back to my channel and see I was one of the only ones telling you that this was coming. But of course, by then, you'll have to be reading it in Mandarin subtitles.
So is it possible that China is behind COVID-19? And is it possible that China and Russia are using social media to spread propaganda and to spy on the US citizens? The evidence is there, but I will leave that one up to you to decide. There is no doubt that there is a conflict between the world superpowers and the penetration of currencies, including the uprising of Bitcoin. But what can happen next? Tensions between the two world superpowers are escalating and may even lead to military conflict. The immediate cause of the First World War was the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria-Hungary, which led to Austria-Hungary to declaring war on Serbia. World War II started when Nazi Germany invaded Poland, which led to France and Great Britain to declare war on Germany. These historical events resulted in the death of millions of people. So what can start World War III? Well, we're now hearing rumors that China is planning to invade Taiwan according to the latest news reports. An event like this could easily trigger the start of another global conflict costing the lives of millions. It is now time for the citizens of the world to wake up and realize what is happening right in front of them. Please do your own research and allow yourself to have an open mind. It's also important that we learn from our history and that we avoid making the same mistakes again. Do your research. Become enlightened.
Understand what's going on around you. You are in a state of war, and you have precious little time to save yourself. It's a slow process, which we call active measures. The first stage being demoralization. It takes from 15 to 20 years to demoralize a nation. The next stage is destabilization. What matters is essentials: economy, foreign relations, defense systems. The next stage is crisis, with a violent change of power, structure, and economy, period of normalization. This is what will happen in the United States if you allow all these schmucks to put a big brother government in Washington, D.C., who will promise lots of things, never mind whether the promises are fulfilled or not. The time bomb is ticking. With every second, the disaster is coming closer and closer.